Okay, hey guys, welcome to today's current event stream. So today, I'm Fatma Raja, and I'm joined by Brandon Wu. And so he hasn't been on an AP Government current event stream yet. But for some context, the AP Language and the AP Government teams are teaming up. So we're gonna alternate hosts week to week in order to make sure that all the AP Lang kids and all the AP Gov kids are getting some consistent updates. And yeah. So we're putting our two minds together, and I'll let Brandon take it from here.
All right. So first, I'll just quickly talk about our social media for Fiveable. So you should totally go follow them on Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. They post a lot of reminders for upcoming streams. We now offer AP subject support for over, I think, 10 subjects with more to come. So you should definitely, stick with Fiveable on their social media just to make sure that you're on top of their streams and their memes. So, all right. So in today's stream, we're going to be covering both current events and the 2020 elections. I will be covering the first half about what's been going on with impeachment updates, other current events, including the NCAA and their athletes. And Fatma will be covering things like the Democratic candidates, the Republican primary, and the upcoming debates. Cool. So with the impeachment proceedings against President Donald Trump, we saw that the House voted 232 to 196, basically along party lines, to begin impeachment. There were actually two Democrats who flipped to the other side and voted no. They are in very rural Republican districts, which kind of explains as to why they voted against impeachment, because they wanted re-election in 2020, and it makes it easier. But also we saw that this vote basically solidified the rules of impeachment, which allows for televised and public hearings and the release of witness testimony. It also gives the opposition, or the Republicans, the minority, in the House, to be able to subpoena witnesses, ask them questions, etc. Also, we've seen that witnesses are still being told by the White House, even after this vote, to defy subpoenas. So the Justice Department actually concluded that senior White House advisors have what's called absolute immunity from congressional subpoenas for their testimony. And you're right, Ashley, Justin Amash, who used to be a Republican and is now an independent, actually voted for impeachment. And that's really cool that he's visiting you tomorrow. By the way, please fill out the poll at the bottom. It just asks what subject you're in. We just want to gauge who our audience is today. And also, if you have any questions, leave a question in the Ask a Question tab or a question in the chat box, and I will get to it as soon as I can. All right, let's talk about impeachment in terms of new testimony. We saw that Lieutenant Colonel Vindman, who is actually a military advisor to President Trump, said that what he heard on the call between President Zelensky of Ukraine and President Donald Trump of the United States was problematic. And that's because President Trump basically told the president of Ukraine that, hey, if you don't investigate Joe Biden, we're going to withhold military aid from Ukraine. And basically, Colonel Vindman pushed for Trump to reinstate that military aid for Ukraine. He also told the White House after they released the transcript that it actually needed to be edited to include more details about what the president said. But the president was like, and the White House specifically, they were like, oh, we're not going to edit the transcript to add these details. And that's the reason why he defied White House officials who told him not to testify, and he went to Congress and testified. There's also another senior advisor named Timothy Morrison. He told investigators that he didn't think President Trump did anything illegal, but he actually opposed the strategy of withholding aid because it would affect our relationship in Kiev and Ukraine's relationship here in Washington, D.C. And we've seen that Republicans like House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy basically say, oh, this vindicates the president. This shows that President Trump didn't do anything wrong. We have firsthand witnesses saying that they were on the call, he didn't do anything illegal. But obviously that's still, up to interpretation. Also, we've seen sources say White House lawyer John Eisenberg actually moved a transcript of that call, of the call recording, to a highly classified server and restricting access to it. And many are saying that that's potentially against the law, putting away things so no one else can see, and no one can access it. But once again, that's up for debate. And as the impeachment proceedings continue on into December and early January, we're probably going to see more updates and more testimony from a bunch of different people. Speaking of new testimony, there is a lot that is happening next. So we actually saw today, about 8 hours ago, that testimony transcripts were released by House committees, such as former ambassador to Ukraine, Marie Yovanovitch, and former top State Department official Michael McKinley, who is actually an aide to our current Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo. So basically, because they passed the impeachment vote, the Democrats now have the ability to actually release the transcripts of those private closed-door hearings. And there was actually a lot of information that was included. So for instance, with Marie Yovanovitch's transcript, we saw that she testified that she had to return from Ukraine in late April because of concerns about her security. And so people are suspecting that, the Trump administration or Ukraine might be doing something to harm her safety. Also, Yovanovitch said that when she saw the transcript of the call between President Trump and President Zelensky, that basically when President Trump said she's going to go through something, she felt really threatened by the president. Moreover, Yovanovitch pretty worryingly reported to Congress that the ambassador to the EU, Gordon Sondland, actually told her that she needed to tweet in support of President Trump, like basically say, @RealDonaldTrump, like I support you in the face of the impeachment inquiry, basically to secure her job. So already we're seeing that other officials are telling people that, hey, if you don't support the president, you're going to get kicked off. So yeah, it's pretty problematic. Also, we've seen with the testimony from Michael McKinley, basically he testified to Congress that the State Department was no longer a good place for him to work. The reason why he resigned is because he didn't want to participate in like digging up dirt on a political opponent. He was also really worried about the fact that Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, or basically the person who runs the State Department, he was not willing to support Marie Yovanovitch. Like basically Michael McKinley pushed the Secretary of State multiple times, hey, please support Yovanovitch, please give her the ability to like make sure she still has her job, right? But basically Mike Pompeo told McKinley that, hey, we think that the president is going to go above us and sweep us under the rug and fire her anyways, even if I support her. So that's why McKinley basically resigned. He said that the State Department was kind of supporting this initiative to dig up dirt on a political opponent, Joe Biden, and B, the person that he was reporting to, the Secretary of State, was not even willing to defend State Department officials. Also, there are a lot of people who will be testifying next in the upcoming days. So I believe on Tuesday, an aide to Mick Mulvaney, or the Chief of Staff, Robert Blair, he will be testifying. We've also seen that multiple lawyers on the National Security Council, like John Eisenberg and Michael Ellis, they'll be testifying. And also one of the the large events in terms of testimony comes from John Bolton, who is President Trump's former national security advisor, who just resigned a few months ago. And he would actually be the closest person to President Trump to testify. And reports and sources basically said that John Bolton actually opposed this whole Ukraine agreement, but his lawyers have come out and said that he doesn't want to testify voluntarily. And most people don't know how you'd respond to a subpoena, given that the White House is basically telling all their officials, hey, do not testify to Congress. You have absolute immunity and executive privilege or whatnot. All right. So in terms of regular current events that are outside of impeachment and the president, we see that the NCAA, which is like the organization that governs college student sports and like a variety of other organizations, they basically unanimously voted to let athletes get paid for the use of their name, image, and likeness. What this means is that basically, for instance, if there was like a college football video game, that if a college sports player's last name was used in that game, that the college player would actually get paid. So this is actually like a pretty large issue of controversy. And I even remember like some of my friends who were in AP GoPo last year, they had to like have a debate about this in class because like some people argue that, oh, college students shouldn't be getting paid, they're students first, et cetera, et cetera. So also we said the NCAA mainly made this decision because of growing pressure from lawmakers. California actually passed a bill into law to make sure that all college athletes make money through endorsement deals. And we've seen that states like Illinois and New York, in addition to the federal government, are currently considering legislation about like paying college student athletes. And so that's why the NCAA was like, oh, clearly public support and like political, I guess, like political movement is moving against us. So they basically voted as a board to authorize student athletes to get paid. All right, the next current event talks about climate change. So climate change, has been like a pretty problematic issue. Yet we've seen that it's arguably gotten worse. Worldwide, we've seen that 300 million people are now estimated to live in places that could experience annual floods by 2050. And to put that into context, 300 million people is almost the population of the United States. So millions and millions of people could get affected by increasing sea levels that are due to climate change in terms of like the ice caps melting. Also, this is 3 times higher than previously estimated, which shows that climate change is basically an exponential increase in terms of it's getting more and more worse unless we take some action right now to actually alleviate the issues of climate change. Moreover, countries in Asia like Bangladesh, India, China, they're especially at risk in terms of rising sea levels. And we even saw Indonesia basically they were the first country to actually be forced to move their capital. They're an island country and they had to move it from Jakarta to another city on Borneo Island. And if you actually look at that bottom right picture there, that is a picture of Jakarta. As you can see, the water is very, very close to the city line, which is why they've had to move a lot of their like government over to a new city. Also, the United States has begun the year-long process of formally exiting the Paris Climate Agreement. So the Paris Climate Agreement is actually a worldwide initiative that is signed by every single country to basically decrease carbon emissions by 25% in 20 years. And President Trump basically said, oh, this is hurting our economy. In fact, he's backed, he's conducted multiple rollovers of things like federal limits on carbon emissions. He has rolled back rules on how much pollution can be emitted by things like power plants, cars, and trucks. And he even negotiated with car manufacturers to make those cars less fuel efficient, basically to support the oil industry and the people who fund his campaign and presidency. And also we've seen that the United States is now officially regarded as the only country in the world to have pulled out of this deal. And it just goes to show how the United States is kind of abdicating its international leadership on a lot of key issues, such as climate change. All right, and the next current event is immigrants and health insurance. So we saw that most recently, a federal judge actually blocked a Trump administration policy that required immigrants to prove that they have health insurance or can pay medical costs in order to get a visa. And basically the White House, the reason why they justified this rule is that they said that it would prevent an economic strain on our healthcare system. But critics say oh, this policy that requires immigrants to prove that they have insurance is basically deterring low-income immigrants and preventing them from entering the country because many of them do not have the ability to pay medical costs because they're in a very low socioeconomic status, or they just don't have health insurance. Also, this block by the federal judge stopped the policy from taking effect yesterday, and it basically will stay in effect for at least the next few weeks. So it just shows that our immigration system is ever evolving. We see that a lot of judges are kind of ruling that many of the Trump administration's policies are they're temporarily blocking them, saying that they're illegal. And we see that it kind of shows that separation of powers or checks and balances, between the judicial branch and the executive branch. It shows that how they those two interact right now. So it's not just something you read in a textbook. It happens almost every single day where the judicial branch questions something that the executive branch does. The legislative and judicial branch come into some sort of conflict, things like that. All right, and the final current event I'm going to be talking about are the elections that are happening tomorrow. So as you may know, 2019 is not an election year because it's not a presidential election, but there are actually a lot of competitive elections that are happening tomorrow. So if you happen to be above the age of 18 and you live in Louisiana, Mississippi, Kentucky, Virginia, Maryland, or the dozens and dozens of cities and states that are holding referendums, please go out to vote. it's really important that you like exercise your like right to vote and, you know, show like basically have an opportunity to voice your opinions on the issues. But also, in terms of current events, we've seen that in Louisiana, Mississippi, and Kentucky, the main elections of focus are the gubernatorial elections or the elections for governor. And it seems surprising that these are competitive, given that Kentucky, Mississippi, and Louisiana are three of the most conservative Republican voting states in 2016 and 2000, like the last time these elections happened in 2015. Yet we've seen that, for instance, in states like Louisiana, the current Democratic governor, John Bel Edwards, basically says that he's like a pro-life, pro-gun, like moderate, I suppose. And basically that's like the way that Democrats win in these southern states. They basically try and talk about like kitchen table issues like healthcare, education, and like basically making sure that everyone has access to affordable, quality education and healthcare. We've seen that in Louisiana, it's actually come out to be a pretty tight election. Although polls put Edwards at +8, we can see that there's like one poll conducted in Louisiana in 4 months. So honestly, it's like a toss-up at this point, given that President Trump has gone to support every single Republican candidate on this list, basically to try and rally up Trump voters and get them to turn out for that Republican candidate. We also see that in Kentucky, incumbent Mike Bevin is a Republican governor who's actually said a lot of things that have basically caused even Republican voters to turn away from him. He has said that like teachers who are protesting were savages. He said he's like cut pension funding for teachers. And honestly, like the campaign that Andy Beshear is running, the Democrat, is very anti-Mike Bevin, basically to try and rally up support of independents and Republicans against the current governor, who's extremely unpopular. As a result, we see that in a state that elected President Trump by 16 points, the governor election or gubernatorial election is in a tie at around 46-46 in polls. And tonight, or actually I think in the next few hours or even right now, President Trump is at a rally in Kentucky to support Mike Bevin and rally up Trump supporters to go out and turn out to vote in 2019. And finally, in Mississippi, we have Tate Reeves and Jim Hood. And the reason why Jim Hood is really popular is he's actually the last Democrat in Dixie, that's like his name, because he's the only Democrat to have held state office in decades. And that's because he's been a really, really popular attorney general who has advocated for policies that are very similar to John Bel Edwards. Like his latest political ad showed him with the gun, like talking about how he wants to protect the Second Amendment and make sure that like he, like, for instance, supports like abortion restrictions in Mississippi, which just goes to show that like Democrats on a national level do not represent Democrats on a state level who are even like winning elections or getting close to winning in very conservative states. And even though Jim Hood is actually polling really like higher than Tate Reeves, who is the Republican candidate, we've seen that unfortunately multiple political analysts have basically said that the Republican has like almost a 100% chance of winning, because in Mississippi, they have like a mini electoral college that actually is a Jim Crow era law that has not been repealed or overturned in the courts yet. And it basically says that you not only have to win the popular vote of Mississippi voters, but you have to win a majority of state house districts. And the problem is that many states, Democrat, Republican, including the state of Mississippi, gerrymander their state house districts to favor the majority party, which in this case is the Republican Party. So even though Jim Hood may very likely win the popular vote, or not very likely, but there's a chance he might win the popular vote, it's very unlikely that he will win state house districts, because in order to win, he basically has to get 62 state house districts out of 123. And the issue is that out of those 62 that he needs to get, 44 of them are majority minority districts, and the other 18 are very rural Republican voting districts that he'd have to flip. So not only would he have to actually gain like voters from like the urban areas, he has to outreach and like interact and gain the support of many rural voters who are traditionally Republican, voted for President Trump, and are conservatives. And finally, the last major election that's really happening is the Virginia House of Delegates and Virginia Senate election. In 2017, we actually saw that it was like the Virginia House was split. What happened was that out of the 100 seats, it was tied 49 to 40. It was tied 50 to 49 for the Republicans. And what happened is that in that last state House district, it was like an exact voting tie, and they basically had to not flip a coin, but they had to like draw out of like, I think, a film canister, and that decided control of who would be holding the majority in the Virginia House. Also, we've seen that in the Virginia House of Delegates, there are like 7 to 8 very competitive districts in which in 2017, just 2 years ago, some of those Republican candidates who won against Democrats won by less than 50 votes, which shows that in local, state, and legislative elections, every vote really, really does matter. And in fact, it's even happened like the reverse in terms of Democrats winning just by a few votes over Republicans. Currently, Republicans have a 1-vote majority in the Senate and a 2-vote majority in both the Senate and the House. And there are multiple Senate and House districts that were won by Hillary Clinton in 2016 and won by Democrats in 2018 that many Democrats are trying to flip. And it's looking very like more and more likely that Democrats will have a trifecta in Virginia. And what a trifecta means is that you have a majority in the state House, the state Senate, and you hold the governor position. And that gives you a lot of power to enact change in terms of your policy. And right now, I think about 20 or so states have a Republican trifecta with less than 15 having a Democrat trifecta. So we're saying that there could be some change after these legislative elections that are happening tomorrow. So once again, if you're above the age of 18, I highly recommend you go out and vote tomorrow. It's really important that you exercise your right and really make sure that your voice is heard at the polling place. You can basically like check online at your state Secretary of State website to see like the ballot and really make sure that you're like researching and educating before you go to the polls. Anyways, I'll hand it off to Fatma now to talk about the 2020 elections.
Okay, thanks, Brandon. And if any of you guys are like confused about how the voting process in your state works, there's a lot of great organizations that you can turn to, like Vote Save America or Rock the Vote, which like give a lot of good information about how the voting process works from state to state. So if you're confused, feel free to check that out too. Okay, so one of the biggest things that happened just this week was that Beto O'Rourke dropped out of the Democratic presidential nominee race. And so the important things to know about him and the reason why he pretty much jumped into the race was because in 2018, he ran for Senate against Ted Cruz in Texas. And so Texas is obviously a very like Republican red state. And so there hasn't been a Democrat that held statewide office in Texas in literally decades. So the fact that Beto O'Rourke got 48% of the vote was seen as something that was like very encouraging to him and to like Democrats on the national level, because it was viewed as something that was sort of like Democrats do have the chance to win in the South. So he turned all of the momentum and the publicity that he got during his Senate election into a bid for the Democratic nomination for president in 2020. And so one of the main things that he talked about on the campaign trail was gun control. And so a couple weeks ago on the debate stage, he was asked a question about whether or not he would buy back guns. And so it was just after the El Paso shooting that happened in Texas. And so he was a very passionate advocate about like more restrictions around guns. And so he even proposed a mandatory buyback for high-powered rifles and said that if people didn't turn their guns in, they would face some type of like penalty. And so he hadn't qualified for the November 20th debate. And the reason why that was super problematic was because the deadline is November 13th. So if you're not qualified by then you can't actually participate in the debate. And he needed to poll at 3% in 4 different polls, but he needed 2 more to actually qualify, so he wasn't quite there. So it was very much looking like he wouldn't actually qualify for the debates, and he was running out of money. So it was becoming more and more difficult to actually like sustain a campaign staff and be running things like ads and doing like the groundwork that you need to do in order to make sure that you win in a state like Iowa, where there's literally people running with millions of dollars, like Bernie Sanders or Pete Buttigieg or Elizabeth Warren. So all of those things made him realize that it probably wasn't going to be a successful like race for him. So he decided to drop out. And so yeah, that was the end of his presidential campaign. And another major thing that happened recently was the fact that Elizabeth Warren, who's now considered to be one of the two main frontrunners in the Democratic field, she released her Medicare for All plan. And this is something that she, during the debates, faced a lot of questions about, like specifically how it would be paid for, because it's a very ambitious plan. It's saying that all Americans would be covered under a governmental health care plan. So even private insurance, it would be eliminated and everything would just be like under this one government run healthcare. So one of the reasons why it seemed to be like completely unfeasible was she also said that taxes wouldn't increase for the middle class. And so the reason why she said this is because the middle class makes up a significant like majority of the voters, right? So if you're doing something that hurts them, then that's not something that necessarily will be helpful in the general election. So her campaign said that it's estimating that her Medicare for All plan is going to cost $52 trillion over the next decade. And so that's a lot of money. But the important thing to remember is that even considering the fact that they're estimating it's going to cost $52 trillion over the next decade, there's a lot of assumptions that the plan makes in order to decrease that amount. For example, they're assuming that they can negotiate lower prescription drug prices, that there's going to be like a very small amount of administrative spending. And so that's just things like how you would fund a bureaucracy to figure out how this entire thing is going to be implemented. And so they also said that they're going to lower payments to hospitals. And so Medicare right now pays a lot less money than traditional insurance companies do. So one of the assumptions that her plan makes is that they're also going to be able to pay that smaller amount to hospitals. So they're estimating that they would pay 110% of what Medicare currently pays, but that's still significantly less than what insurance companies in a lot of cases end up paying. And the last assumption, or the last major assumption that the plan makes, is that healthcare costs are going to grow at a slower pace. So all of those things are pretty big assumptions. And so we're going to look into how she plans on funding this now, because it seems like a very large task, right? So some of the major things that she plans on doing in order to make sure that Medicare for All can actually be funded is that right now, a lot of employers, they pay for their own employees' healthcare, right? So instead of being able to pay for their own employees' healthcare, employers will just instead pay the federal government 98% of what they're currently spending on their employees' healthcare. So rather than paying an insurance company or just like having their own company insurance, that like payment is going to be shifted and instead go to the federal government. And so the federal government is going to administer that funding. And so there are some exceptions for companies that have like unionized workers and some other companies. So those are pretty much like minor exceptions. Like most companies would still have to like pay that 98%. And she also has like a lot of different ideas for taxes that could be implemented that specifically don't target the middle class. And so one of those is implementing a capital gains tax for the top 1% of individual earners. And so what this means that if you're one of the people that's making like billions or trillions of dollars, you're going to face a capital gains tax. And so what capital gains are is, for example, if you buy a stock, then if that stock increases in value, a lot of times people aren't like taxed for it until they sell it, right? And so capital gains tax changes that. And so you're like taxed for the increased value too. And so she's also proposing a higher tax on corporations, higher taxes for billionaires, and making sure that the IRS is enforcing that taxation system better. And in order to make sure that there's less people that are like getting through the loopholes and not having to actually pay their fair share in taxes. So she's assuming that they're going to get a lot of money. Oh, Ashley asks, what does the IRS stand for? So IRS stands for the Internal Revenue Service. And so they're pretty much just the people that collect taxes. Yeah, that's the IRS. Okay, and so one of the last major things that she wants to do is eliminate the Pentagon slush fund. And so The Pentagon Slush Fund is this fund that's called the Overseas Contingency Operations Fund. And so it started a few decades ago, and it was supposed to be intended for emergencies, but now it's used to do a lot more than that. In a lot of cases, the things that the Pentagon's OCO funds isn't even slightly an emergency. So by eliminating that source of money where there's not a lot of regulation over what the Pentagon spends on, she expects to get a lot more money. And so the thing to remember is this plan is 20 pages long. So this is by no means the most comprehensive explanation we could give, but this is the major points. She plans on increasing taxes for the wealthiest individuals in the country and shifting employers' costs by just telling them to pay the federal government rather than insurance companies. And she wants to make sure that the middle class's taxes don't go up. So those are the major tenets of her plan. So that's how Warren plans on paying for Medicare for all. Okay, and so the next thing we're going to talk about is the blue wave. And so the blue wave was this term that was sort of used to describe Democrats being able to get a lot more elections and or win a lot more elections and overturn a lot of Republican held seats into their favor in 2018. So in this context, it's being used to describe the same phenomena, but in 2020. So a lot of House Republicans in swing districts are retiring. And so because they're retiring, it means that they're not seeking re-election. So there's really not any incumbent advantage because there simply just won't be an incumbent in that district. And so a lot of them are coming from places like Texas or Oregon or Georgia. And a lot of these places have traditionally been viewed as more Republican strongholds, but now we're seeing because of a lot of shifting demographics and stuff, their seats aren't any longer safe. And so one specific example is Representative Greg Walden. And so he was the top Republican on the House's Energy and Commerce Committee, and he was the 19th GOP House member to resign. And the reason why this is important is because the Democrats already have a majority in the House, right? And so as they're conducting impeachment proceedings, like Brandon was talking about earlier, having this majority is very important. And so for Republicans to be able to keep some hold on their minority would be important to them in the coming months and past 2020. So the reason why a lot of these people are retiring is because their seats aren't safe. And it makes sense to retire if you've held your seat for decades, if it's not safe anymore, because it just might not make sense for personal reasons. And so partly why they've been influenced is because President Trump has pretty much taken over the GOP, right? There's a reason why a lot of people are referring to the Republican Party as Trump, this Trumpian Republican Party, right? Because a lot of Republicans have been forced to change their policy positions or shift further into President Trump's opinions, because in some cases they've been attacked if they haven't done that. So because these seats are in swing districts, having these views isn't very favorable to them. And so because of demographic changes in places like Texas, where we're seeing more younger voters, or we're seeing more minorities deciding to participate in elections, it doesn't really make sense for them to keep trying to run. And so a lot of them have decided to retire, and them being Republicans in the House. And so the last thing we're going to talk about today. So Ashley asks, did you guys read the tweet Trump sent out to Justin Amash when he left the Republican Party? Yeah. So in a lot of cases, President Trump has criticized people who disagree with him. And so even if they're Republicans, or in this case, Justin Amash, a former Republican, they haven't been spared from that. So that's why they are choosing to just not run again for election. And so Joe Walsh is the former Republican congressman, and he is also a candidate for the Republican presidential nomination. And so we've talked about him in past streams, but the reason why we're talking about him today is because he's continuing to criticize President Trump, and he's trying to also get Republicans to do so. And so the most important thing that he's done in like the past week or so is that he said that the Americans who listen to Fox News and conservative talk radio are being lied to and manipulated every day when it comes to impeachment. And so the reason why he said that is because he is saying that Fox News and like these conservative talk radio organizations are spreading misinformation and not really like being straightforward with what they're reporting. And specifically what he's referencing in this case is like hosts on shows saying that like President Trump like did nothing wrong and that this entire thing is like a witch hunt, right? Which maybe so, but there has to be some like process in order for that to be determined, and it isn't something that should be like a foregone conclusion, right? And so he's saying that impeachment is important because it's a check on the presidency, and so that's also why he supports impeachment. And so he also said that in his personal experience, when he was still hosting his radio show, he was pressured every day to say positive things about Trump. And this is like very significant because it means that like in a lot of cases, we're seeing that people who like even within the Republican Party who disagree with President Trump, they're being like pressured to not do that in order to like have this like establishment support behind President Trump. And so that's all we have today in terms of current events. And